Hello, DC. First time caller, long time listener. I'm very, very pleased to be here right now. I'm Marianne. I work for a company called Auth0. Auth0, for those of you who don't know, we do identity as a service, so basically logins. But specifically, I run a team called Internal Services. And what Internal Services does is we go around the organization and we find all of the things that our engineering teams are building that are actually shared services, and we adopt them and run them as shared services. So I've been running engineering teams for a couple of years now, and I've gotten really fond of promoting this concept of interdisciplinary engineering. And what I mean by that is this idea that other skill sets and other expertise that do not involve programming a computer or scaling a cluster of servers are really effective and valuable in the pursuit of quality software engineering. And specifically, what I want to talk to you guys about today is this idea of design. And if you learn absolutely nothing and remember absolutely nothing from this talk other than this, then I will consider it to be an achievement, which is that design is not about making things pretty. So when your first reaction to this idea of like, this is a DevOps conference, we're like DevOps and SRE people, design is not at all relevant to anything we do. I am here to convince you that that is not the case. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a hypothetical situation. We're going to talk about a mythical command line tool I'm going to call Vmax to alienate everyone equally in the room. I'm very surprised that there is no command line tool already called Vmax. I can't be the only one that likes to poke holy wars in the tech community, but there isn't. So this is entirely fictional, but all the examples I'm going to give you are in fact real examples. I'm just anonymizing them to protect the guilty. So we've never used Vmax before, and we're on a Unix, Linux flavored box. And first thing we want to do is pull up the help menu. How do we do that? Do we go Vmax-H, Vmax-help, Vmax-help, or help Vmax? And so some of you I know are looking at this list and going, this is a trick, because there are clearly two right answers to this question. But actually, they're all right answers to this question. They're different conventions based on different styles of operating system. So the first two probably look the most familiar to you, especially if you prefer Linux-based operating systems, because they're the GNU convention for command line interfaces. And then the third one on the list is really more what X-window environments prefer. And then the last on the list is old MS-DOS, so still kind of relevant for people who use Microsoft-based OSs. And so this is the concept I'm trying to stress here, is a huge part of design is about user expectations. How a user, just knowing nothing else about your product or service, expects to have to interact with it, expects it to be used, makes a huge difference in how they use it, and ultimately how you maintain it. So I'm going to give you another example. We finally figure out how to pull up the help menu for Vmax, and we realize it has this option that encrypts our files using fairy magic. Well, that's great. I love fairy magic. Let's do that. So we try to run the command. Dash encrypts then my file, and I get an error. It's basically a syntax error. It's telling me, you've misformatted this request. The file name needs to follow the encrypt option. And I look at what I entered in my command line and go, it does. What are you talking about, right? So from this point, I'll try a couple different things. First thing I'll try is I'll add an equal sign. Like, OK, maybe I misunderstood what the help menu was telling me, and it actually needs to be dash encrypt equals file name. Nope, same error. Second thing I'll try is actually just removing the file name altogether. Maybe if I don't have a file name, it will prompt me for a file name, and then we can work around that way. Also doesn't work. What does work, however, is adding the file name again after the file name originally, and that runs the command successfully. And obviously, this seems pretty ridiculous because no one really thought about the user interface of these commands. The command line tool in this particular case was kind of like an afterthought that was tacked on. And so when you have unexpected user behavior, one of two things tends to be the result. Either the system or the product that they're using doesn't know what they want to do and gives them an error that may be decipherable or may not be decipherable, or it seems to work. And it can be difficult to sort of see where your preferences should be as a software engineer, because like errors are super annoying and they frustrate users and they make them mad, and then they complain about your product or they maybe stop using it. But if it works and it's unexpected, then we don't actually know what the system is doing in response to that command. Maybe it's doing the right thing, maybe it's doing something else. And if users are using your systems in ways that you didn't anticipate, then it's going to change your scaling needs ultimately, which will ultimately change how you monitor for those scaling needs. So, really important concept about why design is relevant for people like us who mainly stay on the back end of things is that design determines how people use things, and how they use it determines how you have to scale it, when you have to scale it, and what you're scaling when you're scaling. So internal services does a bunch of shared services. And one of the services we deal with is our email notification system. Auth0 is not an email company. Given a choice, we would much rather that you sign up for one of these companies' fine services in order to provide all of your email needs. It's not really our wheelhouse. However, email itself is pretty critical when you're doing logins, right? It's still for better or worse, it's still the #1 way to communicate with your users. So we need to validate emails. We need to do our password reset flows through email. We need to have email present, but we have a core problem with this in that we want to give people a very smooth, very effortless onboarding experience when they sign up for an account. We don't want to tell you, okay, stop what you're doing now and go to a completely different company's website and sign up for a completely different account, then come back with those credentials and we'll start again. So we have this core problem, like we don't want to run our own email servers, but we need you to sign up for an email account. And the way we solve this problem is that we have something called the shared provider, which is just basically a little mail server that we let you make use of when you're setting up your account so that we can give you that smooth, like really nice onboarding experience. And all through our documentation, we sort of say, like, this is not for production. Please do not use this in production. When you're setting things up and you're getting you're oriented, fine, it's there for you, but like, please don't use this in production. However, this is a screen cap of the portion of our website where you set up your email provider. Does anything jump out about this screen to you immediately? So there's definitely something that jumped out to me the first time I saw this. It's a lot of numbers. Yes, the display of IP addresses is not ideal. That's true. But the thing that jumped out at me is that I had this toggle that was off by default, and all of the configuration options below it where you set up your mail server were also grayed out by default. And I kind of looked at this and I said, like, from my perspective, if I am configuring something and all the options to configure it are disabled and the forms are grayed out, I see that and I go, this is optional. Because if it wasn't optional, it wouldn't be grayed out, right? So we have our documentation that is telling users one thing, and then we have the actual interface for configuring this service that is telling users the exact opposite. And which one do you think wins? Yeah, so the #1 reason why we get pages on this service is because people are using this shared provider in production and they're blasting out thousands of emails onto our shared provider. So in taking on this service, we started to do a couple of different things. One is that we had to change kind of the internal logic of the shared provider so that we could better handle these kind of like random surges of email traffic for no reason. And then the other thing we're doing is like looking at the design of that page and going like, how do we communicate to the user the appropriate way to use the shared provider? So another service that we just now actually started to formally onboard to our team is our feature flag service. And Auth0 uses feature flags for a lot, right? So we use it in sort of the traditional, gradually rolling new features out to users in small increments, but we also use it for API versioning, and we use it for custom configuration. If you're a customer of Auth0 and for some reason you want something turned off from our default features, we can flip a flag, and for all of your users, that feature will not be available to them. And then we use it for things like A/B tests as well. And when we started talking about taking this service on, the powers that be from my perspective, the people I report up to, were sort of like, yeah, probably should just shut this service down. There are these wonderful feature flag as a service providers that are out there. 2 of them are out there right now in the sponsor hall if you're interested in talking to them. Like these people, that's what they do is their business. We want to focus on our core business and it's not running feature flag services. So please shut this down, shut down this service that we're maintaining and just migrate all of these flags. And I was kind of like, okay, well, see, there's something about that makes me a little uncomfortable, and it's these 2 use cases, because these are what we call long-lived branches, which means that unlike feature flags that you use to gradually roll out features or feature flags that you use to run experiments, these are flags that once created, you're probably never going to remove from your code. Right? If you're using feature flags to do custom configuration for your customers, you're going to want that flag there for the lifetime of the customer. And so what happens if this third party goes out of business or gets bought by a competitor or the quality of their product deteriorates? Do you really want to hand over the core business logic of what we do to a third party in this way? And so we decided that before we made any decision about the future of like keeping our feature flag service or throwing it out and buying somebody else's feature flag service, that we actually wanted to take a hard look at like what this service was and what its problems were. So we started off by talking to our engineering teams internal to Auth0. And we talked to 2 basic groups of people. We talked to the people who were using this service, and we were talking to the teams who built the service in the first place. And so like some of this conversation will probably sound very familiar in maybe a slightly traumatic way, because this seems to be like generally the way things play out when you have a disagreement over the quality of a service that's internal. The teams who use this service were like, it's unreliable, it won't scale, it's not nearly as good as what we could buy, we just need to get rid of it. And the team who built the service would point to the data we had in Datadog and the monitoring and our incident reviews and go like, it's never had an outage. It has very aggressive SLOs and it's always met them. Like the only time we've ever really had to like kick off an incident is because the SLO was slipping, not because we were having problems with it. It's very stable, it's very reliable. These people don't know what they're talking about. And then the team who used the service would say like, okay, sure, but like sometimes it errors for no reason, and like that's a huge problem and indicative of like the quality of the engineering. And then we would go back to the team who built the service and like say, well, what's the deal with this? And they'd go, yeah, we designed it to do that. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Like, why? Why did we design it to do that? And what was going on is that when people would stand up flags, sometimes they would finish with them and forget to update all the code that was accessing the flag. And so the service would produce like a fairly standing warning error just saying, hey, you're asking for a flag that I don't have. It doesn't exist. Maybe go back and update your code. And the team that maintained this service would go to the engineering team and say, hey, you're calling this flag. It doesn't exist. Please clean up your code. But, you know, like all engineering teams, they're busy, things get prioritized in different ways, things fall through the cracks. Like teams weren't always being super diligent about keeping their flag assets up to date. And that made it really hard to tell when a flag was missing because it was a flag that had existed but didn't exist anymore, or someone had mistyped a legit flag, because that's a far different situation. If you're supposed to be calling a flag that does exist and you've mistyped the command for whatever reason, now we've changed the behavior of the application that our users are experiencing, and that's a big problem. So the engineering team got really, really annoyed with the fact that people weren't being more diligent about keeping their flags clean, and they decided that anytime you called a flag and it errored, it would just like basically get critical error and shut things down. And I would say that, like, in general, I prefer to err on the side of designing things to be really simple and easy for people to do the right thing, rather than designing things to punish them when they do the wrong thing. Largely because when you punish people for doing the wrong thing, they generally turn around and find a wronger thing to do instead to work around the punishment, right? And that was sort of the types of behavior we were seeing. People were doing some really interesting things to get around something going wrong with the feature flags that they didn't understand what was happening. So we came to this core challenge because it seemed to us from talking to people that the problem with this service was not the service, it was the user interface of the service. But we could fix that, and if we did fix that, people would use the service more. We definitely heard people saying, like, I don't really use future flags unless I absolutely have to because I don't understand how this service works and I don't really trust it that much. So my question to my engineering team is, if we fix this stuff and we start to see double the activity or 3 times the amount of activity, how do we know that it is in fact as stable and secure as the people who maintain it now claim that it is? Especially since we have the data on its performance and we've given it to the people who are complaining and they don't find it persuasive at all. So they're not actually like listening to the data that we all agree is a good standard. So we decided to do something a little unusual. We started to use this tool called Gremlin. For those of you who don't know what Gremlin is, it's a chaos engineering tool. It basically sabotages your infrastructure for you in a nice little controlled way that's like super, I get super giddy. And so Gremlin can do things like eat up resources on your instances. It can sabotage your network connectivity. It can kill dependent processes, all sorts of things like that. And what we did is we set up a load test environment for this service specifically and started running load tests while using Gremlin to basically point a cannon at the service at the same time. And what we ended up finding is that the service was actually way more resilient than even we thought it was. We got it up to like 50% of packet loss. And the only reason why we stopped at 50% is because at 50%, we were losing connection to the load balancer, which was then turning around and killing the instance and restarting it. And then we got it up to 99% utilization across 36 cores of MongoDB, which again, like we stopped at 99 because going to 100% utilization was just not kind of a fundamentally useful test. But throughout all of these tests, we saw very few to no failed requests at all. So this service, despite an incredible amount of abuse that we were dishing at it, was actually like still online and still serving requests and still returning the correct values to flags. So we came to this sort of question, like, if this service is so good, like, why does everyone believe that it isn't that good? And it really came down to the interviews that we did with people who were trying to use this service. Every single time, one of the main questions that we ask people is we say, sit down and take me through the steps to create a flag. And this is like one interview. This is my notes from one interview with one team. There are, depending on you count, anywhere from 9 to 12 different steps. Some steps actually have 2 steps in them because I was taking notes really fast. Most of these steps are manual. And no one agreed on which steps there were or what order they were in. So this created a situation where, because the only thing that our engineers experienced was the sort of user experience of this service, they weren't monitoring it, they weren't responding to pages, they weren't on call with it. The only thing they knew about it was how they interacted with it. And because the interaction was so unpleasant for them, it created a perception that this service was in bad shape, when in fact, it really wasn't in bad shape at all. So how do we figure out, if user expectations are so important, how do we figure out what user expectations are? There's a very simple answer to that question. We ask them, right? So design experts, particularly those who specialize in UX, will conduct things called user research interviews, which basically just means I sit down with the user, I ask them to use the thing that we're building, the product or service that we're building, I watch and document how they use it, and then I ask them follow-up questions about it. Things like, well, why did you choose to click that button? Or, well, what do you think you should be doing here? Or what do you think about that response? What do you think that response means? Things like that. And what's important to understand about user research interviews is they are not training exercises, right? So people don't like to be in a situation where they don't know what the right answer is, and when you're conducting a user interview and someone finds something that's confusing to them, their natural inclination is to look at you, to explain to them how you're supposed to use the thing that you've put in front of them, or to go like, is this okay, or things like that. And you need to like hold yourself back from going like, no, you don't click that button over there, you click this button over here, you put these values in this format instead of the way you're doing. You gotta hold yourself back from doing that. Because when you're conducting user research, there are 3 basic types of information we're looking to get. First thing is we're looking to get where are there points of confusion or misunderstanding in this experience of using this thing that we've put in front of them. Second thing we're looking for is what is the incorrect behavior they go for when they've had a misunderstanding about this product that we put in front of them. And the third bit of behavior that we're looking to capture, if we can, is how does the service respond when you hand it that incorrect behavior? So if you stop them when they've made a misunderstanding, then you lose the ability to collect all of the rest of the data that you're looking for when you conduct these interviews. And so you're probably thinking, like, okay, cool, but I can't test it before it exists. So I had to build the thing, and then I had to test it, and then I had to go back and rebuild it based on user interviews. And not true. If you have an existing backend service or even an existing software as a service that you're looking to reevaluate, you can do user testing right now, but ultimately, ideally, you should start testing before any code is written at all. But how do you do that? So when we're talking about conventional website interfaces, the easiest way to do it is use things like wireframes, right? We can kind of sketch out what the interface should look like, mock it up, put it in front of the user. You can also do something called paper prototypes. This is a particularly elaborate example of a paper prototype. It is a paper iPhone with a long strip of paper that has a sketch of every single frame you could possibly get through this application. And they also have paper pop-up windows so that they basically take you all the way through the application, including notification pop-ups that might pop up and all of that. So this is a very elaborate version of a paper prototype, but they don't have to be that elaborate. They can be much simpler than that. And what we would do, because we're primarily talking about services that are consumed by other engineers, we're talking about APIs, we're talking about libraries that people are installing, is that we would say to them, okay, go to a piece of code that you have and talk us through how you set up a feature flag. We might do something like that. Or we might go to an API reference of something we're evaluating or a design sketch for our API interface that we had in mind and put it in front of them and say, if you have this function and it takes these parameters, what are your expectations about that? What do you think these parameters mean? What formats are you expecting them to be in? What outputs are you expecting to get? How would you interpret this error versus that error? Things like that. Same with endpoints, looking at what an endpoint should look like for this service and do they expect it to be a RESTful service, pure RESTful, or some variance on that or some different interface, so on and so forth. So to be clear, I am not a designer, and I don't expect anybody in this room to sort of become a designer because you sat and listened to me talk for 30 minutes. You're not going to become a designer. That's not the point of this talk. But especially if you work at an organization of a pretty substantial size, somewhere in your org chart, there are designers. You have these experts already accessible to you. And they would love to come and contribute and to feel valued and respected on all parts of the engineering org. So if you want to start incorporating these sort of things into your processes as an engineer, I think the first best step is to reach out to your actual design community where you're working right now and sort of get their feedback, bring their perspective to the table. And then one of the things that we're doing right now is actually trying to figure out how to hire designers that specifically work with back-end services so that ultimately we have our own resources to consult with as we continue to build things for our engineering teams. So I want to leave you with this tweet that my friend tweeted literally last week, and I was like, oh my God, this is perfect. This is going on my slide deck, just putting you on notice. James is a friend of mine. He's an SRE and an occasional organizer of DevOps Day Boston. And I want to just re-emphasize the concept that design is literally everywhere. If you think that it's not with what you're looking at, it's just because it's really well done. And when design is really poorly done, it becomes really obvious. So thanks, guys. That's it for me. I will be around if you want to grab me and ask some questions, but I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you guys.